Okay, so the Reconstruction Acts of March of 1867, um, as I said before, all the ex-Confederate states were placed under military rule, with the exception of Tennessee, for reasons that I'm not going to go into. Tennessee had a very complicated history. Anyway, so Texas becomes military district number 5, Texas and Louisiana. Um, um, Virginia is military district number 1. And so the South, in some sense, is under occupation, while African Americans are given protection by the U.S. Army, because Southern whites were not willing to even go a centimeter in the direction of giving African Americans any political rights, any social rights, they're very busy trying to, in some sense, re-enslave African Americans via these black codes. And when the 14th Amendment is originally passed, the Southern states reject it unanimously. So this is what they get as payback. When Congress comes under the hands of the Republicans and moderates that are aligned in 1867, that have a veto-proof majority, Congress really comes down hard on the South by sending in troops to register African Americans. Some other aspects of the African Reconstruction is that no state could be readmitted to the Union unless it had ratified the 14th Amendment, and unless the state provided for universal manhood suffrage. So one of the aspects of the Reconstruction Acts of March of 1867, what Congress is saying to the White South: you don't have a choice about the 14th Amendment. If you want to be part of the United States, you have to accept it. You have to pass it. Otherwise, you'll never be part of the United States, and we'll keep troops down there as long as we want. The other aspect of it is that some of the ex-Confederates who had gained leadership roles in the South after the Civil War, kind of amazingly, were now rendered ineligible to serve in government or run for office. So a select group of whites, especially significant ex-Confederates, do for a short period of time lose their ability to stand for political office. And so what happens is that by 1868, you have a new set of constitutions that have been written in the South. Remember, the first post-Reconstruction constitutions had been written by whites. But after African Americans were registered for the vote, they elected new constitutional conventions, which wrote new constitutions. But what's key about these later constitutions is the African American voice was heard. African Americans, although they were never a majority in any of these state constitutions, suddenly now African Americans have a significant say in the politics of the ex-Confederacy. You have African Americans ultimately serving in state legislatures. African Americans, I think his name was Hiram Johnson, was elected, an African American was elected to the U.S. Senate from South Carolina. In Texas, I think the total is something like 13 African Americans were elected to the state legislature. One of these was a man by the name of Matthew Gaines, and Matthew Gaines was a very significant engine in the creation of Texas A&M University, because the highest priority for most members of state legislatures once they gained some power was education, because under slavery African Americans had been denied the ability to learn how to read and write. So what you have in kind of broad strokes is, for the first time in U.S. history and in the states of the ex-Confederacy, you have African Americans gaining political power and a political voice. Now, they never dominated the states of the South. For instance, in South Carolina, even though South Carolina itself was more than 50% African American, the state legislature of South Carolina was never more than 50% African American. Um, uh, in the Birth of a Nation, there's a famous scene where you have the state house in Columbus, South Carolina, and it's all African American, and they're eating chicken and eating watermelon, and they're in bare feet. Again, this like incredibly racist view of what Reconstruction was all about, when in fact, in almost every case, the politicians, the African American politicians that were elected to legislatures all the way from Texas to Virginia, were hardworking, dignified politicians that had the strengths and weaknesses of all U.S. politicians. Certainly not the racist image that you saw in Birth of a Nation. So the key is that the 14th Amendment allowed African Americans the right to vote, citizenship rights. This vote was guaranteed by the presence of U.S. soldiers. That if they had not been there, if U.S. soldiers had not been in the South as African Americans registered to vote, there would, without a doubt, have been violence against African Americans. And then whites start boycotting these elections as well. Southern whites are just completely enraged. They're incandescent with anger at the registering of African Americans to vote. Many of these folks who had been slaves just 3 years previously. And it's through these boycotts, through the white boycotts, through the registration of African Americans, that you have new constitutions written in the South that the black voices heard. The 14th Amendment is ratified in the South. And I have to stop right here, and I'll start in just a second.